So today's seminar we have Rabbi Kirsch, who's our next speaker. So that was just a little introduction. And while we have Rabbi Kirsch, we would thank Rabbi Kirsch and the JLE for letting us host the events once again at the wonderful premises. Thank you, Rabbi Kirsch. And we're also on the Rabbi Kirsch is going to speak now on Temple 2019, The Home as a Sanctuary, is the first lecture of the Art of Giving seminar. Rabbi Kirsch.
I'd like to thank the lovely Rabbi Stepsky. What a wonderful Jew he is, eh? An opportunity to share some ideas with you. You know, as I look around the room, I see some people I recognize from the past, and that's a wonderful blessing. But also it's a bit dangerous because you've heard all my stories as well. So you'll excuse me if I need to repeat them at any stage. You know, when we're talking about the tabernacle, and we're talking about bringing that into our lives and appreciating the gift of giving, it's fascinating to note that in this week's Seder that we learned yesterday, begins with the words Vayakel, that Moshe Rabbeinu gathered the Jewish people. What's interesting to note is if you look at Jewish history, you'll notice there are a few events that happened on the same day. Rashi points out, Vayakel Moshe gathered the Jewish people together the day after Yom Kippur. Because the Jewish people got atonement for the sin of the golden calf, complete forgiveness. And now it's the next day. When was that forgiveness? The forgiveness was on Yom Kippur itself. We're now ready for the next day, and the next day is the day after Yom Kippur. What's fascinating to note, if you see in Parshas Yisro, you'll see that when the father-in-law of Moshe, and by the way, this is not a talk on father-in-law's interference, we're not doing that at all, or mother-in-law's. When the father-in-law comes to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, I've got some advice for you, and the advice is how best to judge the Jewish people. So there Rashi again points out, when was this advice offered? It was the day after Yom Kippur. Interesting enough. Moshe was judging everybody to day and night because after all they just received the Torah on Har Sinai the second time around. They got forgiven for the golden calf, that was Yom Kippur, they got the Torah. Now Moshe Rabbeinu is back in circulation with the people, and a lot of people got lots of questions. Ask the Kli Yakar, what's the connection between the fact that Moshe gathers the Jewish people to prepare them to build the Mishkan in yesterday's Sedra, and the fact that that took place after Yom Kippur, as was the fact that he was judging the people. He says very interestingly that the Jewish people were told they're now going to build a Mishkan. They're now going to build a house for God. They're now going to build a temple. They're now going to a place where God himself can constantly dwell amongst the Jewish people. And they had lots of questions, which was, if I'm going to build a home which is suitable for God, what am I going to build it with? So he's told us how to build it. He's told us the gold and silver. But am I sure that the gold and silver which I'm giving is acquired in a kosher way? Am I sure, now that I've heard the Ten Commandments, now that I've heard the Torah Mount Sinai, now that the Jewish people have received the Torah, do we know all the responsibilities inherent in that? Is the money that I'm using to build the temple kosher money? And therefore, says the Kli Yakar, the day after Yom Kippur, when they were told to build the Mishkan, they had lots and lots of questions, which is why Jethro had to come forward and say, you need to reorganize yourself, Moshe. There's thousands of people with lots of questions. Is this gold? Is this silver? Did I get it in a kosher way? Is it okay? Because when you're building a temple, friends, you have to make sure that not only you build it with your hearts, not only do you build it with your soul, but you build it in such a way that in every aspect of it, it's a holy and special place. And even though it's hard for some of us to truly appreciate this, we're actually building a temple on a daily basis. And it may be far from your mind when you walk through the door that actually your home is a temple, but as we're going to see, it very much is just that. The Talmud explains, the Gemara explains that when people gave gifts to the temple, it had to be from their own. Vayikra tells us in the beginning of Leviticus, when the Jewish people give any temple gift, it had to be mikem, it had to be your own. Because if you're going to make a difference to the world through your giving, you have to make sure that that which you're giving is truly yours. And the only way to make a difference to the world around us is the Almighty wants you to give that which is yours back to Him. The Almighty wants you to give that which is yours back to the Jewish people and to the world around you. Let's go on a little bit of a journey. So here's the story you may have heard before, but it's one of my favorites. A number of years ago, my lovely friend, Rabbi Yisrael Roll, you may have met him many years ago. He was in Edgware. Before then, he was in a shul in the New West End in the centre of London. And he once took David Simcha for a haircut in the area. Now, just to put it in perspective, you're going for a haircut in New West End, sort of Kensington neighbourhoods, you've got some pretty upmarket, uppercuts, haircuts. So according to his story, he walks into this barber and he says, this is over 30 years ago, is that Lady Diana there? Because just opposite the New West End Synagogue is Kensington Palace. And if you remember, 30 plus years ago, Charles and Diana were living together in that place. And apparently William had to have his haircut as well. And according to the story that he told me, and he's a reliable person, Rabbi Roll, he went into the hairdresser and there he was. William with Lady Di and the lady in waiting, whatever it is. So if you remember, according to the storyline, sadly, there was some Sholem bias problems at home. Charles and Diana weren't doing as well as they could have been doing. And Rabbi Roll, being the forward gentleman that he is, said, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm your local rabbi. And if there are any issues you'd like to talk about, you can find me. This is my address. I'll be happy to help. And Lady Di apparently very politely accepted the gift, or gave it to Lady in waiting. Thank you very much indeed. I know where to find you, as if to say. And William finished his haircut, and then it was time for David Simcha. So Rabbi Roll picks up his son, pops him onto the hairdresser's chair, turns to his son and says, I want you to know that you are sitting on the same chair, the throne of the future King of England. Didn't give dates as to when he was going to become the King of England, but nevertheless, you're sitting on the throne of the future King of England. And then he turned to his son and he said, but David Simcha, I want you to know that before the Jewish people received the Torah and Har Sinai, before that, the Almighty gave us our credo. The Almighty gave us our mission statement. And our mission statement is, Va'atem JLE mamlechas kohanim. You are going to be a kingdom of priests. David Simcha, you were born into royalty because you're a member of the Jewish people. We were told our mission statement is you're going to be a kingdom of priests, which means each one of us are priests. Each one of us are working in the temple. Each one of us are part of a very holy nation with individual holy endeavors. And each one of us has got to remember that on a daily basis. And amazingly, at a time where we would hope and pray for a big temple, we often forget that actually the place for our temple, the place where we can learn to truly give, is actually our home. The Gemara points out something fascinating. When you wake up in the morning, and the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning, hopefully, is you say, Modi ani lefanecha. The next thing you say, hi sweetie, how are you? Oh gosh, I've got into trouble already. The next thing you say is, would you like a coffee? Should I change the baby? Or whatever. Should I change the adults? Or whatever it is. And of course, the first thing a Jew does when they wake up in the morning is they wash their hands. And the Mishnah Berurah discusses why it is we wash our hands the first thing in the morning. And of course, everybody knows that during the night you may have touched something which is inappropriate, unclean, and therefore you have to wash your hands. Second of all, we know that an aspect of the soul leaves you when you sleep, and it enters and exits for the... But there's a third reason as well, which is that we learn about the Kippur in the Beis Hamikdash, which was a wash basin, that the Kohen was forbidden to do any avodah in the temple until he'd washed his hands and feet. And actually, watching some people wash their hands in the morning and getting their feet wet, maybe you continue the tradition to this very day. The first thing we do in the morning is we wash our hands because we, in 2019, are Kohanim. We are Mamleches Kohen and we're Goy Kodesh. And just like the Kohen would not be able to do any service that day without washing his hands, our day starts by us washing our hands, because we likewise, in our holy sanctuary known as our home, we're also Kohanim. We are Mamleches Kohen and Goy Kodesh, and we're going to serve the Almighty. And actually, I saw Rav Shimshon Hirsch and Rav Kook both speak about the ideas that we lift up our hands in the morning as we've washed our hands, and we say as if to say, and what am I going to do with you today? That's how we start today. Su'u Yedechin Kodesh, lift up your hands and Baruch Hashem and praise the Almighty. Because I'm a Kohen, and I'm going to do special things with my hands, and I'm going to be in control of my hands, not my hands are going to be in control of me. And then we go downstairs into the kitchen, and of course, the table's already laid. Thank you very much for doing that for breakfast. And it's the breakfast, the school lunches are already made, so there's no hassle. It's a very relaxing environment. So we go downstairs, and following Chazal, we know that breakfast is one of the most important meals of all days. As I told Rabbi Stepsky many years ago, you have to eat well, sleep well, and learn well, and then life is much easier. And the day starts with a significant proper meal. And you have for breakfast to start with. And of course, what we'd like to do is we wash our hands for bread. You may not, but follow this analogy. And the Mishnah Berurah says, why do you wash your hands for bread in 2019? So of course there's a cleanliness factor. There's no question about that. Of course there's a cleanliness factor. And of course there are many messages. But the Mishnah Berurah says one of the reasons you wash your hands for bread is because when there was a Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim weren't able to partake of the truma, which was a special gift which was going to the Kohen. 2% of your fruits, your vegetables, particularly your wheat, your grapes, your oil, all had to give to the Kohen. The next 10% went to the Levi. It's truma. And truma is sanctified produce, and the Kohen had to make sure that he was spiritually clean in order to eat it. Which means in 2019, before you have any bread, to remember the fact that the Kohen used to wash his hands to make sure he was clean. You're Mamleches Kohanim for Goy Kodesh. You're a holy people. You're a holy nation. And likewise, we wash our hands because we're undertaking a spiritual act akin, on our level, to working in the temple. And of course, there's some salt on the table. And why is there salt on the table? Because the Gemara in Brachos tells us when there was a temple, the altar would act as a place to get forgiveness from. But nowadays that we no longer have an altar, your dining room table becomes your altar. Your dining room table, your kitchen table becomes the sanctified center of your Jewish home. And Bizman Hazeh, says the Gemara, Shulchano shel Odom is mechapen. Just like every sacrifice had to have salt on it, likewise every time you have bread, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday or Shabbos, you have to make sure you have salt ready to dip your bread into the salt. Because your bread and your kitchen and your dining room table is part of the heavenly endeavor of the temple itself, the tabernacle itself. And the Mishnah Berurah, quoting the Gemara in Brocha, says there's another addition to that. When does your table become an altar? When you learn to share that which is on your table with others. When you extend your table. Of course, primarily it's to extend it to my family and to make sure my children are well fed and looked after. But I should use the blessings I've been endowed with and teach them the lessons of sharing that gift which I have with others. Now's not the time to go into it, but the commentators ask the whole question, which is, what am I giving when I'm bringing a sacrifice to God? And part of the message which is found in the commentators, they explain, because I'm becoming closer to God by giving back that which is given to me to make the world into a better place. And likewise, when I give the gifts that the Almighty has bestowed upon me and I share them with other people through my dining room table, I'm giving God the gifts that He's given me to make the difference in this world. And your dining room table, your kitchen table becomes an altar. And the children don't sit on the table. And the children don't mess it. Because a table, I mean, goodness me, a table is an altar. A table is a shulchan. The kol karboncha takriv melech, and every sacrifice had to have salt on it. Every sacrifice, not to salt it to get the blood out. A biblical imperative in Vayikra is every sacrifice had to have salt on it. And therefore, every dining room table has to have salt on it, because your dining room kitchen table is a holy, holy, holy place. So you wake up in the morning, in your bedroom, you wash your hands, because I'm going to serve the Almighty. You know, a number of years ago, I had the great privilege of sitting with Diane Fisher, Zichrono Livrocha, in at that time he was the head of the federation based in, and I sat with him at a simcha, and he'd studied together with Chofetz Chaim in Radin. And I decided to ask Diane Fisher, Zichrono Livrocha, like, tell me something about the Chofetz Chaim, like, tell me a story, tell me something about it. So he said, I'll tell you a story. He said, we used to take in turns when the Rav was very, very elderly, to look after him, to care for him, to worry about him, to make sure that everything had in. And I remember getting up early one morning and turning to Aryeh Leib Grosnos, who later became a dayan based in the United Synagogue, Zichron Livrocha, and I said to him, Aryeh Leib, we used to call him the Deutscher, he was originally from Germany, Aryeh Leib, it's our turn to go and wash the Kohen HaGodol and prepare him for his service in the temple. That's what he said to me. And he lifted up his hands and he said to me, and these hands wash the back of the Kohen HaGodol, the Chofetz Chaim. That's what they used to call it. These hands wash the back of the Kohen HaGodol. That's my story about it. And I always remember that story because we realize that our hands may not be washing the Kohen Gadol, but our hands are producing the little Kohanim who are around our family. Our hands are making our holy home into a temple, a tabernacle. And our hands are sharing the benefits and blessings we've been endowed with, to share them with our family, to share them beyond as well. And we put salt on the table to remind ourselves that we have an obligation to turn it into sacrifice. And the commentators point out amazingly that salt has this great power to draw out something which is within. That's why you salt meat, to get out the blood which is in. And the commentator is saying part of our life's goal is to draw out that which is within us as well. And when we put salt on table, we remind ourselves, how can I draw out the responsibility, the obligation, the gifts I've been endowed with, and ensure that they grow and they develop further and further. And of course, the bread that I baked, I forgot to say that, didn't I? Of course, I took challah. In 2019, I took challah, and for the last 1900 years, I haven't been able to give challah because the Kohen haven't been around, or we don't know who's a challah. But in the old days, when the Kohen would come home from work, he would get fast food ready for him because he would have dough that every woman, every person separated dough would be preparing and giving to him. And even though there's no Kohen, I'm taking challah in my kitchen when I make my own doughs to remind myself of what a temple is and to remind myself that I have the opportunity through giving to connect to spirituality and to connect with the Kohanim. It's really incredible, actually, as we start thinking, there's much more going on in our lives, in our home, which is connected to the temple, than there actually is with the synagogue itself. We know that there are many things in the Bet Knesset, in the shul, which remind us of the temple service itself. But when you start realizing how much there is in your own home, you'll realize that actually your home needs to become that temple that we speak about. The Rav Shimshon for Hirsch brings our attention to the first mitzvah that the Jewish people received when they would come out of Egypt. And it really needs for us to focus on this because, friends, a lot of people don't realize, and none of us don't really focus enough on the fact that we are living in a temple. We are living in a tabernacle. We're living in a holy place. And as you walk into your home, you're walking into what is your spiritual epicenter. And specifically today, where the world around us is a little confused, to put it mildly, this becomes, listen carefully to the words, this becomes our sanctuary. This becomes our sanctuary. So Shimshon Hirsch points out what is the first mitzvah that the Jewish people received after they came out of Egypt. So people actually get this wrong because they say the first mitzvah the Jewish people received when they came out of Egypt was the mitzvah of the calendar. It's not exactly true because the verse says, Vayom Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron, Moshe and Aaron were taught the laws of the calendar because the primary obligation of the laws of the calendar are going to be the Sanhedrin, of whom Moshe and Aaron represented. And once the Sanhedrin hear from the witnesses when the new moon is, they'll choose and say, yes, they're right, correct, the month has just begun. That was an obligation which was given to Moshe and Aaron as members of the Sanhedrin. The next mitzvah is, Dabru el kol adas Yisrael, speak to the entire Jewish community. Lamor, saying to them, Be'osa l'chodesh hazeh, on the 10th of this month, v'ikhu lahem, and you should take for yourself, ish ser, every person should take a little shepsler, leveis ovot, to the house of the fathers, ser lebayit, a little paschal lamb. And the way, says Rav Hirsch, that the first mitzvah is described to the Jewish people is, everybody's got to bring an animal for their house. Everybody's got to bring a sheep for their bayit. And the commentators go on to point out incredibly, what's the message to be told that the first obligation you have is to do it in your home? Is because that is your very first and primary obligation, is your home. It's making your home into a holy place. And in this case, it would take the little shepsela and they would tie it to the bedpost and all the significance that goes on with that. And your first sacrifice in your first home begins its life being tied to a bed. And the Mechilta points out something extraordinary, which is that the first ever Mizbeach, which was in the Jewish home. What's my proof for that? Says the Mechilta, because the mitzvah of bringing a sacrifice is only fulfilled when you take the blood of the sacrifice and you daub it on the side of the altar. You slaughter it, now's not the time to go into Kodshim, but if your sons and daughters decide to want to meet anybody from Brisk Yeshiva, then I highly recommend you do your homework first and know all your sacrifices back to front. If we have any Kohanim here amongst us, there's a lot of work to do, and since you're all Kohanim, it's worth understanding it. But the primary obligation is to take the blood from the animal and to daub it on the side of the altar. Says the Mechilta, that's what they did with the first ever family event. They took the animal, they shechted the animal, and they daubed it. He says there's a machlokas and Mechilta, whether 3 altars or 4 altars. Altar on one side of the doorpost, altar on the second side of the doorpost, and altar on the third side of the doorpost. And he describes your door of your home being a mizbeach, being an altar, as you daub the blood on all 3 sides of the thing. So the first inaugural mitzvah was in the Jewish home, done by the Jewish family, done by the unit of the Jewish home, turning that home into a sanctified sanctuary. And the first bringing of the blood, the first altar, was on your doorpost. And it's very interesting because if you have a look at the language of the Rambam, the Rambam speaks very, very vividly about our obligation to how we're going to use that door, how we're going to use the very doorpost. And I'd like to share with you, if I had the page, the language of the Rambam. Says the Rambam, Chayev odem lizor b'mezuzah. Person should be very careful with the mezuzah. Mipnei shehi chayves hakol tomid, because it's an obligation upon you continuously. Now it's a very interesting language of the Rambam, because most mitzvahs are dependent on certain dates, certain times. You keep Shabbos once every 7 days. I'm sorry to keep mentioning Pesach, but Pesach is in 7 weeks' time, but who's counting? It was a few days before Pesach, and there's a woman desperately moving her furniture around, and her friend comes in and sees her trying to schlep this enormous couch around. And the friend comes up to her and says, "Sweetie, what are you doing?" She said, "What am I doing? I'm cleaning for Pesach. I'm trying to move the couch." So she says, "Well, why don't you wait till your husband comes home?" To which she says, "It's much harder to move it when he's lying on it." Anyway, sorry. Present company, obviously, moving swiftly on. Anyway, so the Rambam says, "Chayev odem lizor b'mezuzah." You have to be very careful with the mezuzah. There's some mitzvahs which are date, Shabbos, festivals. There's some mitzvahs where, when the opportunity comes your way, you have to do the mitzvah. For example, I bought a suit; it has to be shatnez tested. If I didn't buy a suit, it didn't need to be shatnez tested. Right? If I want to have meat, it needs to be shechted. There's certain mitzvahs which are opportunities come your way when you do the mitzvah, but there are very few mitzvahs which are with you 24/7. Very, very few mitzvahs which are with you the whole time wherever you go. I always tell my children Kibbud Av Ha'em is one of them. Got to remember that one at all times. It's one of my favorites. And Hashem, they're doing very well. And I'm working on it myself. So that's an example. But one of the mitzvahs which is constantly with you is the mitzvah mezuzah. Continuously with you. Every time you walk in and out of a home, listen to the language of the Rambam. V'chol zaman she'yikanes v'yetzen. Every time you go in and out of your home. And it's interesting to see the language. Every time you go in and out of your home, yifcha b'yichud Hashem. You encounter the oneness of God. How do you encounter the oneness of God when you come? Because in the mezuzah it says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And if anybody's ever unrolled a mezuzah, you'll see the first word you see. The first words you see when you unroll the mezuzah is Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. It's specially rolled, so that's what you encounter first. V'chol zaman she'yikanes v'yetzen. When you go in, you should think and contemplate on the oneness of God. Shemo, Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayiska avosa, and you should stop for a minute and you should think, I'm going into my house. I'm moving from one world into the other. And I'm going into this special, special sanctuary. Vayiska avosa, and you should remember the love after Hashem Elokeinu v'chol levav v'chol nafshecha me'yadecha. Beautiful. B'shiftecha b'veisecha, when you sit in your home. B'shachbecha, when you get up, when you lie down, uvkamecha, when you get up. That's when you're supposed to do. Now, people may lie down at work, but the place you lie down at is in your home. When you're sitting in your home, this is where you're encountering the Almighty, continuously. And says the Rambam, V'yah mishanoso, and you'll wake up from your slumber, ushkioso mehavle azman, and the confusion that you have being so involved in the vanities of the world, and you'll remind yourself what primary and what's secondary. And what primary is that my home is a sanctuary. My home is a place where I can be a true Jew. My home is a place where I can be a giving person. Giving to my family, giving to God, giving to the world around me. And just like all the gifts in the temple have to be mine to be able to give, and just like every sacrifice had to be mine in order to give, I'm giving not only the gifts that I have, but I'm giving myself when I'm serving the Almighty and building my home. The greatest gift I have. And Maimonides says, as you go into your home, there's that wake-up call that this place is surely very, very different. This place is surely very, very special. This is my sanctuary. And this, as was the first ever altar, was on the doorpost of our home. And friends, you know, when you consider the history of the Jewish people, it's worth reminding ourselves that when the first dating went on, it was about not just finding the right girl, but making sure that the right girl and the right guy could build something special together. Remember, our lovely friend Rabbi Ziskin once explained to me, of course you know that he's an architect, and a couple came to him with a description of their ideal home, what it's going to look like, what's going to be like, it's going to have this, kitchen, bathroom, amazing. And in their discussions with him, with their list of priorities and how they wanted their house, they said to him, Mr. Ziskin, what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to build us a home. To which he said, I'm an architect, I build houses, you build the home. And the home is built when it's an altar. The home is built when it's a sanctified place. The home is built as a spiritual epicenter to the entire world. And as I explained, there's so many more mitzvahs in that home than nearly anywhere else in the entire Jewish world. And as you walk into the home and you encounter the mezuzah, you remind yourself of the power and the energy which is the sanctuary of the home. If I want to become a giving person, that's where I train to do it. If I want to be a sensitive person, that's where I train to do it. And in fact, we learn something fascinating. Because the Kohen HaGodol, the high priest, as the Mamlechas Kohanim, the high priest would have bells on the bottom of his garment. And the Gemara says that whenever he moved around the temple, everybody knew where he was. Everybody knew that he was coming. And Rabbi Kiva had some advice to his sons, and he said to Rabbi Yeshua a number of pieces of advice. And one of them is that before you go into your home, you knock on the door. And certainly before you go into a stranger's home, you knock on the door. How do I know that when I go to my home or to a stranger's home, I knock on the door? Not because you let it in an etiquette booklet, Not because your mother said, you've got to knock before you go into the house. It's because the Kohen Gadol had bells on his clothing on the meal, and wherever he went, you could hear him. And that's why when we go into a home, we knock. Rav Gifter points out something amazing, which meant that every time the Kohen Gadol moved, he made a sound. What's the significance of every time you and I move? We should realize we're making sounds as well. And as you enter into your home, you knock on your door. And I once heard from one of my teachers, what happens if the Kohen Gadol goes in somewhere and there wasn't somebody there? Let's say, it wouldn't be Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, he wouldn't wear the meal. But let's say he walks into a room, there wasn't somebody there. The bells still made a noise. And I said, okay, what's the significance? And he said a fascinating idea. He said, because the Kohen Gadol has got to remind himself, I'm not just the Kohen Gadol. And nothing happens here in the temple without me. But rather, every part of the temple houses the Almighty, and I'm a visitor in his temple, even though I'm the Kohen Gadol. And those people who want to say that an Englishman's home is his castle have got it wrong. An Englishman's home is God's castle. An Englishman's home is where the Almighty dwells. And therefore, even if nobody's in, he says, you should knock on the doors to remind you who really is the boss in my life. He wants us to give of what we've got, but he wants us to remind us who's totally in charge at all times. So we're mentioning about the first ever shidduch. Baruch Shem Avram and Sarah, beautifully married. Eish Eschal Miyimsa, the songs that we sing, amazing. And sadly, when Sarah passes away, it's time for Avram to find a shidduch. He sends Eliezer, and Eliezer finds Rivka for his beautiful son Yitzchak, Avram Avinu's son Yitzchak. And Rivka moves into the house, but Yitzchak's a bit nervous as to whether she's got the real qualities. And then he notices that there were 3 symbols that Sarah Imenu had in her tent, and only when those 3 symbols returned was he confident that she's going to be the wife to carry on his mother's mission. And Rivka is truly a mother of the Jewish people. And of course we know what those 3 symbols were, which was that the dough that she baked remained fresh from one week to another. And anybody who wants to understand the fact that in the temple they bought the lechem haponi, they bought the bread, the showbread on a Friday, and the new groups of Kohanim who came in the following Friday got some of the bread, and that's interesting. That means the bread that she baked remained fresh, which was actually experienced when there was a temple. But it started in her house. And the temple, as if today, continued. Oh, and the lights that she would light on a Friday would continue to illuminate the home throughout the week. Well, you may go to a shul and you see there's a ner tomid, an everlasting light in the shul, to remind us that in the temple there is a ner maravi. Had it not been for the fact that the Kohen had a daily obligation to clean out the menorah, the lights would just carry on and on miraculously. That's interesting. She had a light burning, which when we built it, but it started off in her home. And of course, the cloud of glory was always above the tent of Sarah. And when Rivka married Yitzchak, it returned back. So when they say your home should be a mikdash ma'at, a little sanctuary, that's exactly how the first Jewish home was. It was a living, breathing temple, tabernacle, sanctuary, which when Yitzchak saw that Rivka was able to do, he saw that she was a true mother of the Jewish people. Many years ago in the town of Belz, the Hasidic Rebbe, talking about bells, now you go to Jerusalem, you see the Belz shul, which is like breathtakingly enormous. The town of Belz was quite a small place. And the Rebbe would sometimes interact with members of the broader community as well. And apparently he had this sort of friendship with the police chief. So the story goes. And sometimes, on the way home from work, the police chief would pop in and say, hello, how are you? Thank you. And the non-Jewish police chief comes in one day, and there's a bottle of schnapps on the table. And the Rebbe says, would you like anything to eat? Now, I don't know the legal aspects of a policeman having a drink in the. I don't know how this works, but anyway, the police chief takes off his cap, and he drinks the schnapps. And he turns to the Rebbe and he says, when I take my cap off, he says, I'm no longer on duty. So this is how it goes. I'm a policeman, I take off my cap, hop it down, and there, I'm no longer on duty. And according to the story, the Rebbe turns to his Hasidim when he next had the chance to give him a drosh and says, maybe that's why we don't take our caps off. We never take our caps off, because we're always on duty. There's no concept of us not being on duty. We're on duty 24/7 at all times and all places. And like the Kohen would walk into his temple and remember himself it's not his temple, it's his temple. When we walk into our home, we remind ourselves that I am a mamleches kohanim, I'm a goy kodesh, I'm a holy nation. And it's very interesting. I look forward, please God, to coming into your homes and enjoying it. One of the lovely things that we do when we first inaugurate our home is we have a Chanukas Habayis, inauguration of our home, which is a lovely thing to do. But you may be fascinating to know where the language Chanukas Habayis, inauguration of a home, comes from. You got it. Mizmar Shir Chanukas Habayis LeDavid. A song of gratitude to the Almighty of the fact that King David and King Solomon were able to inaugurate a temple. Your home is a sanctuary. Your home is a temple. Your home is the epicenter of the Jewish world. And if that's a home where you are bringing your daily offerings to the Almighty, through the smiles that you give, through the kindnesses that you give, if when you wake up in the morning you say, what difference I can do with these hands? I'm going to raise my hands. These are going to be giving hands. These are going to be caring hands. These are going to be sharing hands. These are going to be hands which are going to make a difference. That's how I wake up in the morning. And when I wash my hands for bread, I remind myself I'm a holy person. I'm part of the Kohanim. Today, 2019, I'm washing my hands for bread to remind myself of the sanctity of the Kohanim. And I've got the salt on the table to remind myself of the obligation that my dining room table becomes the center of giving and sharing and caring. And as I walk through into my home and I see that mezuzah, I get a little kiss on the mezuzah, I said, Hashem Echad, God is one, and I'm going to bring into the home God at all times. You know, it says, V'shinantam levanecha, you should teach your children, v'dibata bom, and speak about them. And the simple explanation is that you should speak about the Shema, we just explained beforehand. One of my teachers, when I was a youngster, teenager growing up, was Rabbi Isaac Bernstein, Zichron Levracha. He was the Rav of Norris Lee Shul, and he had this amazing Irish accent, and he'll forgive me if I attempt to say the Dvar Torah like he used to say it. He used to say to us as follows: when the children are very young, says the parents like to bring the children to sew me. This is my little one, he's 3 years old, Rabbi, and he's just put a kippah on for the first time, and now he's got tzitzit as well. And then they bring them to see me when he's 5 years old, and they said, you know, Rabbi, he's learning to read now, he knows his Aleph Bet, he's doing really well. 6 and 7, the parents like to show off their children. He says sometimes when the kids get into the teenage years, they're not bringing the parents are actually always bringing the kids to show them off to me. So maybe they're a bit embarrassed of something like this. He said to me as follows, remember this very well. He says, Vishinantam levanecha. If you bring them into a home, if you create a true Jewish home in all aspects, where there's sanctity, where there's holiness, this is a temple. My language is different in the temple. I don't shout in the temple. This is the Holy of Holies. Right? I don't lose my temper in that. This is the holy place. This is a place which becomes the center of giving, of caring, of sharing. This is the holy place in the world. If you keep a temple like that, Vishinantam levanecha, and you teach your children properly, V'dibata bom, you'll speak about them, your children. Which is not the simple explanation. It's way off the explanation, but it's a clever little play. Not V'dibata bom, you speak just about the Torah mitzvahs, but actually, if you create the temple environment, then all the little Kohanim who are running around the home, all the little kings and queens and priests of that Maleches Kohanim, you will be blessed, please God, to talk about them, to be inspired by them, and to see them as the great priests of the Jewish people that they are. And it's been a wonderful opportunity to share some words with the Kohenei Gadol, both the men and the women of the future generation. And our blessing is, you should merit, as it says, that when a young couple get married, they say the zivug should be ola yofa, that the zivug, this joining together, should be go up in a beautiful and beautiful way. And the word ola can also mean a number, numerical counting. And the word yofa means beautiful, and it's spelt yun pei hey, and that's gematria 95. And we say that the couple should be 95s. What's 95? V'osa li mikdash v'shochanti v'sochem. The 95th mitzvah of the Torah is, you should build a home, which is a temple, and I should dwell within you. And Yetz Hashem, you'll merit to build a home together, which will be a home of giving, of sharing and caring as the temple was, and you'll build a place where the Almighty will want to dwell with you continuously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Kirsch. Wonderful, beautiful insights.